Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Donc, je me présente rapidement.
I'll introduce myself briefly. My name is Charline Vincent. I'm an epidemiologist and I'm one of the PREVAC investigators. The PREVAC study was carried out in November, December last year in the Paris area, in Marseille, in the south of France, trying to identify the drivers that would explain for the vaccination of people underprivileged in France. Literature has reminded us that the underprivileged are more exposed to COVID-19 and that a higher risk of mortality was observed in underprivileged areas. In addition to these problems, there are multiple obstacles to access to healthcare for those people. Literature considers that people who are very precarious will include homeless people, but also people who are housing poor, and this can be described in various aspects. Their housing conditions do not meet the standards in terms of hygiene and comfort. Many have had a recent history of homelessness. Housing and accommodation is quite often temporary. They are in shelters. They are in a financial and administrative dire situations, and they are faced with many barriers of access to rights. It is considered in France that some 200,000 people are in this situation in the Paris area and the Marseille area. They are usually less vaccinated than the general population, and we wondered what was their access to COVID-19 vaccination. When our research protocol was drafted, there was no data available on the vaccination of these groups of people. In addition, the targeted vaccination could only be made available thanks to the involvement of local NGOs. That is why we also wanted to assess the impact of their actions. The first objective was to assess the COVID-19 vaccine coverage amongst the homeless and precarious people in Marseille and Paris, and compare them to the general population, considering that one dose of vaccine was already a vaccinated person. The second objective was to analyze the factors which are limiting or promoting access to this vaccination. We've carried out a stratified multi-center cross-sectional survey between November 15 and December 2021 in Paris area and Marseille. There was a random sampling of the size with clusters which were proportional to the site. And in order to develop these sites, we've worked with various local authorities, representatives, as well as NGOs. We've also selected the participants. We've also selected a participant with a two-stage cluster design, with a sample random sampling whenever possible, and when we had access of list of residents or rooms available, which was not the case for those who were homeless, where, of course, there were no lists available. We've also had 15 to 20 minutes individual interviews face-to-face in the place where they were living in their native language. Either the surveyor would speak the language of the participant, or we used interpreting by phone. We had a grid of questions on a tablet, and we've interviewed people on their vaccination status, reasons for vaccination versus non-vaccination, social demographic data, health literacy, etc. Our assumption was 55 to 60% vaccination coverage as a function of the groups and the people. We had 5 groups: those who were in asylum seekers shelters or emergency shelters, those who were in social hostels, in migrant workers' house, in streets, camps or squats, and people who are homeless. And for those who are in Marseille, we've used the COVID homeless cohort, which already existed, and included the various accommodations I've talked about earlier. The sample size was approximately 3,700 people. And then to make the reading of results easier, because some groups look alike, we've grouped some Paris and Marseille groups for the analysis as a function of the place where they were accommodated over the last quarter. Those who were housed were those who were staying in their own house or in a worker's house. Accommodation stratum was those who were in asylum seekers hotels or social hotels, and the street stratum included those who were living in streets, in the camps, in slums or squats. It was a global analysis, and regarding the univariate analysis, we used a logistic regression. Out of the 3,690 people interviewed, 855 were in a house, and 2,321 were accommodated, and 515 were living in the streets. For the first group, those who had a house, 85.6% had at least one injection, as opposed to 75.4% for those who were accommodated in shelters, and 42% in those who were in the streets, while the general population at the same time had a 91% vaccination coverage, at least one dose of the COVID-19 vaccine. Now, if we consider the results per group, you see that those who were housed, had a home, seem to have a better vaccination, better than those who were accommodated in shelters, who had better results than those who were living roughs. So they went to vaccination centers. 18% have relied on outreach vaccination activities, and 14% have relied on GPs or pharmacists. The reason for vaccination, most of those people who had vaccination reported personal protection, and also because they felt compelled in November, December last year. People who were vaccinated were given a vaccination certificate, which would allow them to go to public areas and to go to work, for instance. Some also considered that there was a need to protect vulnerable people, or because they had a positive opinion about the vaccine. Those who didn't have no vaccination said they didn't want to be vaccinated. Either they didn't want or they didn't have the opportunity to be vaccinated, and only 25% of them said they didn't have access to the vaccine. And we've selected the correlated association to perform our multivariate analysis, and I will be presenting the significant results only. Based on our results, the likelihood of being vaccinated goes up as a function of age, administrative status. People who were asylum seekers had a higher rate of vaccination than the French or European people. And also, if the meals were given on site and when given for food distribution, or they could find solutions for their own food, the likelihood of being vaccinated was higher. And also, when the vaccination was readily available on site, or if the source of information on COVID-19 was that of provided by the site manager. No, it was lower when the COVID information source wasn't internet or social media. When people had a negative opinion about vaccination in vaccines in general, and the usefulness of vaccine, or because they had some fear about the vaccines. Now, for those who were not living by themselves, those who didn't have to show the vaccine certificate, and those who didn't have any medical coverage or didn't have any GP, the main limitation in this study is that we did that in daytime. some people were at work. So we have probably an overrepresentation of women for those people who were accommodated or in a house, and maybe we have an overrepresentation of elderly retired people. Some people didn't want to take part in the survey, maybe because of language barriers or for more personal reasons. No, it's the very first COVID-19 vaccination coverage study carried out in Europe covering underprivileged people, and the first one in the areas where people lived. So amongst the very precarious, we had the lowest vaccination rate as opposed to general population. Access to vaccination follows the gradient of precariousness and integration. The further you are from the mainstream society, the less you're likely to be vaccinated. The reasons for vaccination were personal protection, protecting others, but also because people needed their vaccination certificate. And the reason for non-vaccination is that people were either reluctant or skeptical or were against vaccinations. And awareness raising seemed to be a key factor in vaccine uptake, particularly when it's given by trustworthy third parties. And the national vaccination strategy did work for people who were accommodated or in houses, but not for those who were living rough in the streets. And now the proposals we've submitted to the French authorities were to implement actions that were adapted to the living conditions of these people and for the severely excluded support, comprehensive social support, but also improve access to accommodation and housing. And more generally speaking, for people who are underprivileged, make social workers aware of the importance of the support they're providing to these beneficiaries and enhance the outreach vaccination activities. I would like to thank all those who've taken part, people in the field, investigators, etc. Thank you.